call me, D.
Virginia sits at the top of the South and the bottom of the North. So for a long time, we didn't have our own identity. We've heard stories from Baltimore, Atlanta, DC. The list goes on. Most of our city's history is lost in graveyards or locked away in a prison. So I don't tell you these stories to glorify the street life or the criminal element. I want the youth of the day to understand who their fathers were, their mothers' fathers were, and we today are descendants of those stories. So if you're a Richmond native, this is what you come from. But there's a time in history where the streets was saw as the only way out for us, to us, especially when something has kept you fed, protected, warm, and alive, because we all have an instinct to survive. And during these times, everything was about survival. Richmond at war, 1990s.
This ain't the 60s, this the 90s, this the 90s, this the 90s, this the 90s, this the 90s.
I want to introduce you to a man named Ralph Emanuel Henderson, but for the sake of the video, we'll refer to him as Ralph. Born in the year 1966 and raised in a small city of Richmond, Virginia, he'd see the face of rejection the moment he was born. That rejection would come from the very person who gave him life, his mother, likely due to an active drug addiction at the time. On the back end, he had an awesome father, and he'd be very active in his life, which compared to other black kids growing up, it was seen as rare, under the consistent stigma of absentee fathers in the black community. Now, thankfully, his grandmother would step in, taking responsibility as the motherly role. But as we know, a mother's bond with her child is stronger than any connection you could have with someone. And this reality would still take a toll on Ralph's mental state as he travels throughout life. He spent majority of his life in Gilpin Court housing projects, along with a lot of his older siblings, which could be up to 5 or better. So while reaching an age where he could fully understand why mom was absent, having the thought that his mother never wanted him would send Ralph into a deep depression, harboring anger that an impressionable teenage boy's mind wasn't equipped to handle. But he would adapt to the pain, and that negative energy would eventually lead him directly into the streets. Now, Ralph from a very early age had a presence that demanded respect. Dark eyes and a broad smile so spontaneous that it instantly made you uncomfortable. But he had the heart of a regular guy and a great sense of humor. He fully steps into adulthood during the mid-80s when the crack epidemic would change whole cities within a year's time. By the early to mid-90s, Ralph would still have both feet planted inside the streets. Not to mention, while being the worst time to be in the game if you are a Richmond native. So while navigating through the darkest days of the city, he'd meet a group of guys called the Cook-em-Up Crew. And eventually, he'd meet the alleged leader, and his name was AKA, it's said that he picked up that nickname because of the way his nose ran after snorting. But back in those days, you could say was as common as smoking weed is today. Another party drug for most folks, but was considered the heroin lord or kingpin that controlled that specific area during the time, and also other areas of the city from around March 92 to April 95. But in doing research about this individual, the name Andre Smith also comes up a lot, in several articles proclaiming him to be the actual leader of the Cook-em-Up Crew, along with 3 to 4 other members. So unless everyone holds a place in this organization, or because both factions operated out of Wickham, maybe authorities got a few lines crossed. Now in between that time, its main distribution point was within 500 feet of an elementary school, more specifically Wickham Elementary, would receive large amounts of high-grade on a weekly basis from his supplier. That source being a 34-year-old Colombian national named John J. Restrepo. While there's little to no information about this plug, he would end up switching sides later down the line. So while being fed an unlimited supply of grade A, Robert controlled distribution through his street workers, made up of over 40 different individuals, male and female. But their main base of operation was the 2300 block of Bethel Street and Wickham Court, which is a short walks away from the elementary school we spoke about earlier. So the man with no proof of legitimate income would be bringing in enough money to drive a 1989 Cadillac and flaunt about $40,000 worth of jewelry on a daily. Now, it isn't clear if Ralph worked directly with or under them during a specific time period, but we do know of his connection with several people working with the Cook-em-Up Crew, most notably a guy named Darrell Henderson, aka Lil Money. They had grown up together in Jackson Ward, being the best of friends, and they were much more different than they were alike. Darrell, who stood about 4 feet 10 inches tall, born premature with Crohn's disease, a little self-conscious about his height, but in contrast with his size, he made up for it with a huge, hard-to-ignore personality. He was also whip smart, attending Virginia State University for 2 years after finishing John Marshall High School with honors, but he was prone to trouble. He had been arrested for possession of back in 1992 and had a slight gambling addiction. And in many ways, Ralph represented what Darrell wanted to be. Now, Ralph was more than a foot taller, and he worked hard to get what he wanted. He did not graduate from George Wolfe High School, but went on to get his GED and certificate from Richmond Barber and Styling Crop. And that same ambitions he'd had on one side of the game, he had on the other, eventually finding his niche at Harvey's Progressive Barbershop in the downtown location of Richmond. During this time in the 90s, if you decided to walk in without booking an appointment, you'd most likely see faithful customers sometimes waiting 10 deep. The combination of command and awe and admiration kept customers standing in line for their turn in that chair. The shop was originally owned by 83-year-old Franklin Harvey Sr., a man who earned recognition for inventing the Afro Master Pick comb. Developed the comb in 1970s, and he will retire back in October of 2016. It gets to the point where he wants out, and for good. All he did was work and come home, being around his girls most of the time, and saw a different future for himself. There's no known specific situation or motive on why he wanted out, other than wanting to change his life, but more so for his family that consisted of his girlfriend, his 2 beautiful daughters, and his grandmother. He would later find reconciliation with his biological mother, who was still at the time battling a drug addiction, still felt the need to let go all of that pain that had plagued him throughout his life. So while going through this life transition, he'd acquire a house out in Chesterfield County, where he'd park his new 1990s Lexus. While bringing his family along, of course, he also moved in his grandmother. His intentions were to return that favor of his grandmother filling that motherly role, taking care of him since the day he was born. It's February 16th, 1995, and today's just another normal day in the city for Ralph. As time passed into the night, Ralph told the family he was going out to the store to pick up some milk and to meet up with one of his guys. In that moment, the family didn't know who he planned on meeting or even the nature of the meet itself. Ralph being out late wasn't out of the norm, and also not out of the norm was a man by the name of Marvin Damon, aka Boogie, a known hitman or enforcer for drug kingpin, would stop by around 10 p.m. looking for Ralph while he was away. He would always come by here and there, so Ralph's involvement with the street element may not have been completely severed during this time. But without the facts, it's up for speculation. Ralph's daughter, Portia Taylor, who was 5 years old at the time, remembers Marvin's visit. Marvin, while entertaining the 5-year-old by playing toy Barbies with her, he inquired to her mother about Ralph's location, where she would then tell him he was gone, without revealing where he actually was. Even though he frequently visited the family, asking of his whereabouts just seemed a bit strange at the time, so he'd wait, sitting on the living room couch, tossing couch pillows back and forth like a normal Thursday evening. An overwhelmingly tense situation it had to be for the family. And he'd be there for a good 20 minutes or so before leaving the home, prompting his fiancée to call him several times after. A brief amount of time goes by before Ralph would call back, noticing the multiple missed calls from her. She'd now inform him that the guy, Boogie, was looking for him. After receiving this heads up from her, he told her he would be home a little later, further saying he was going to have dinner with his longtime friend, Darrell, at the Friday's restaurant on West Broad Street. Now, sometime after Ralph gets off the phone with his fiancée, either during or after meeting up with Darrell, they come into contact with the 45-year-old man named Fred Bull and the man who just left Ralph's family not too long ago, Marvin Damon. The man Fred who accompanied Marvin was a part of another faction from the south side. He more so acted as an enforcer or lieutenant himself under another big player named Douglas Dodson Jr., aka Becky. It's said that while Douglas ran a drug enterprise, it helped him control the Blackwell and Hillside communities during that time, threatening to harm residents if there were any pushback or complaints on where he wanted to distribute his drugs. So as it stands, there were several key individuals from different sides of the city connected by this one meet with Ralph and his friend Darrell. The story goes that Darrell owed some money, and as his enforcer, Marvin was there to collect it. Now, was Ralph just there by chance? Maybe he wanted to help his friend by fronting him some money to pay off the debt. Or he was there as moral support, just in case something goes down. But still, it doesn't explain Marvin's visit to Ralph's home. Unless this being a strategic move by Marvin using Ralph to get to Darrell. Now, at some point, an altercation occurs when Marvin demands payment from Darrell. And Ralph, being a loyal and devoted friend that he was, he made it clear that if Marvin and Fred had a problem with little money, they also had a problem with him. But standing firm beside his friend would be costly, as Marvin and Frank would eventually handcuff Ralph and Darrell together, placing them in the back seat of a Grand Prix. Here's where Marvin would almost interrogate Darrell about the money he owes, and as before, he'd give him nothing but more excuses as to why he didn't have the money. Mid-explanation, Marvin fires several shots into Ralph's face, and while still trying to plead his case, Darrell would meet the same fate, being shot point-blank range in the head as well. As the sun rises, Ralph's fiancée awakens to his ongoing absence, most likely not receiving an answer after calling him multiple times, because this was more than anything out of the norm for him. So like anyone, she feared the worst had happened. She would file a missing persons report on her fiancé Ralph, and on the other side of town, on a 2400 block of Carmine Street in Wooken Court, Darrell's girlfriend was doing the same for him. Days and days go by, and rumors ran throughout the city that Darrell may have been the reason that Robert's drug organization was taken down by the feds. In short, they thought he was snitching. But several people, even law enforcement, would say it's all speculation. But we all know too well how the streets talk. By the time the story gets back to you, there's been several theories about what actually caused this to happen. And on Wednesday, February 22nd, residents in the Southside neighborhood just off Midlothian Turnpike noticed a car sitting behind an abandoned house at the address 10 Chuckatuck Avenue for several days. Someone eventually became suspicious, seeming that the vehicle had not been there before, so they investigate. And upon looking inside, there sat both Ralph and Darrell deceased. Both men were still handcuffed together, as some bystanders would say they were linked in death.
The city's murder rate soared and eventually doubled, making Richmond the second deadliest city per capita in the United States.
So with these two guys meeting at the Friday's restaurant on West Broad Street, they were killed in one place and dropped off in the other, ending up a 20-minute drive away on the south side, making it almost 7 full days before anyone found them. Neighbors would say that only a handful of cars come in or out that street. So if that not being a fact, it just may have took longer to find them. They also thought the murders to be highly unusual, even in the homicide-plagued Richmond at this time, asking questions like, what was the killer or killers trying to say? Referring to the bizarre images of two men handcuffed together and shot so many times in the head region that they were unrecognizable after. To some people outside the criminal realm, it was bizarre, but not knowing that there were multiple people and families killed in the manner of Ralph and Darrell, made as the gang's signature, but more so a message to others who decided to make the same mistakes of their recent victims. So all of it was very puzzling, so to speak. Police would notify Ralph's family. They would only say that they had found him, but never said that he was dead. So it was a huge surprise when they got there, seeing all those people in yellow caution tape everywhere. Heartbreaking for everybody. Now later that day, at the family's residence in Chesterfield County, Marvin shows up to give condolences to the family. The actual man who made sure that his kids grew up without a father would pass back through that door and pay his respects, figuring that this cold, careless act would keep his name out of the loop of this case. But Ralph and Darrell's murder weren't the only notches under his belt, and police weren't far behind. So ultimately, Marvin Jerome Damon, Douglas Becky Dotson Jr., and Fred Bull Jr. would all be connected in the death of these two friends, but not all would be convicted due to a lack of evidence. Investigators had already come to a conclusion that the murders were drug-related, and with that comes a large web of connections to different drug factions in the city that would come down almost simultaneously.
You gonna lock me up for some drugs? I ain't got no money in my pocket.
But more drugs are found. Keep an addict spied for a few hours. The 2nd Precinct's Special Operations Unit fights drugs 365 days a year. It's drugs and death. We've been in Blackwell for about 30 minutes. Nothing so far until the officer pulls off this man's hat.
Now, Richmond, Virginia has some of the most untold street war stories in history. And aside from the cook-em-up crew, there were way more factions of gangs that were active at the same time.
I mean, I've been literally 6 feet away from a person that got shot in a drive-by when I was buying on the south side of Richmond. A kid got shot in the neck and in the hip. I've seen people robbed. I've seen people completely lose their whole family out here. My mom ended up getting murdered. She was getting high while she ended up getting murdered at a party.
Like the Dog Pound gang who operated on the West End, the St. Valentine's gang out of Churchill on the East End, or the Jackson Ward Boys from the North Side, Jefferson Village on the South Side, and the Newtown gang who also operated on the South Side, and the Blackwell/Hillside housing projects. The city was easily averaging several murders a week back in those days, and Marvin was knee-deep in the thick of it all. But let's rewind a bit. I want to take you into the early days of Marvin Jerome Damon. Now, majority of his childhood remains to be told, but Marvin's career in the streets will go back as far as the early to mid-80s. On August 12, 1980, Marvin was only 14 years old, and this would be his first documented attempt murder by shooting a guy named Stephen King in the back. There was little information about the ordeal other than Marvin confessing to the crime later on in his life. 5 years later, at the age of 19 years old, the Northside-born native lived on the 2200 block of 5th Avenue. In the beginning of the year, 1985, Marvin would threaten the life of a 17-year-old boy named Herman Carter Jr. Time would pass up until the day of April 3rd, where it's speculated that Marvin killed Herman, shooting him several times in the back of the head. That next morning, his body was found on a path near the 1300 block of 5th Street. Marvin would be arrested shortly after, where he remained incarcerated on a $16,000 bond. But after months of investigation, Marvin's murder charge was dropped due to a lack of evidence, but still charged him for threatened bodily harm in connection with the victim. So after his release, it was right back to the trenches for Marvin Boogie Damon. After the alleged murder of Herman Carter Jr., we fast forward about 2 years into the future. It's now the year 1987, and on the 19th of June, now 21-year-old Marvin would find his way into the East End neighborhood of Creighton Court housing projects. There's a section of Creighton Court shaped into a roundabout, which is where a woman by the name of Alice Lewis lived. And at 3342 Bunch Place is where Marvin would fire multiple shots into her apartment, attempting to take her life, but was unsuccessful. And now just 1 month later, on July 17th, 1987, Marvin would attempt to kill Sheila Denise Turner and Barbara Turner by shooting up the vehicle they were driving at the time, making this attempted hit pre-planned and premeditated by being promised drugs or money if he had finished the job. Now, I've done a little local research on this guy, and in during Marvin's peak, he was said to be like the Omar of the neighborhood. Not to the extent of drug dealers dropping packs out of a trap house window, but there were even little kids who knew of his name, mostly by Boogie or Bug. I had the chance to speak with a person who grew up in one of the neighborhoods Marvin used to frequent, and he would say this, and I quote, "If we were outside playing and you seen Bug coming, it was time to go in the house." Now, Marvin played a role in the group of guys that handcuffed his victims as a warning to other guys who dared to cross him. So he earned his reputation through years of inflicting fear and death. Now, about 7 years later, we're heading into the 90s. Specifically, it's the year 1994. And Wookham Court is what we would say today, bussin'. Far as drugs being sold like candy in and out of the Bethel Street Strip. A 37-year-old man by the name of Louis Pooler, who frequently bought product from the Cook-em-Up crew, owed a debt, and this angered. Now, it isn't specified on if he just sold drugs, used them, or both. But on the day of March 3rd, 1994, after several warnings, Louis would get a call one day from. He said to meet him on the 2300 block of Bethel Street around 7 p.m. And upon meeting, they have a brief conversation with one another. After a while, turns to leave. But before Louis could do the same, Marvin Damon runs up behind him, throwing one shot into the back of his head. But even while the man lay there, obviously deceased, Marvin would stand over him, shooting him several more times in the head again. And just a few feet away from this grisly scene, there were children playing inside of a backyard nearby. possibly traumatizing them forever, an image that they'll never forget. The news of Lewis's death hit his mother in the worst of ways, because 7 years back, on March 18, 1987, Lewis's father, her husband also, named Lewis Pooler Sr., would be stabbed to death by someone with a butcher knife. The killer was never caught. His son Lewis Jr. was incarcerated at the time of his death, which makes this event just that much more horrible. Because she later found out her grandson, Lewis's son, was currently incarcerated. So this 18-year-old boy's grandfather was killed while his dad was in prison. And now his own father has died while he himself is in prison. One can only hope he found his way out of that generational curse and eventually broke the cycle.
When you smoke, dopamine and other chemicals flood your brain within seconds, but the rush doesn't last.
It was something that made people hype, but it didn't last long. So that would make you chase it over and over and over.
We now have a second generation of addicts and dealers who grew up in the midst of the madness.
Just a few months down the line, we head into the year 1995 when Marvin was at his most treacherous peak in the streets. Now, April 20th, 1995, 2 months after the double murders involving Ralph and Darrell, Marvin would attempt to kill a woman named Nicole Williams and a man named Lonnie Booth. 2 months after that, on June 1st, he would rob a man by the name of Tyrone Williams inside of the Wickham Court Projects. It seemed as if he was on a spree, a binge, or he was taking any job that he could to stack up some money and leave town. I make this assumption due to the new violent task force formed of 10 members from local, state, and federal officers, and their mission was to bring down, as they call it, the baddest of the bad. The unit's officers would roam the streets in search of violent criminals and try to arrest them before they commit serious offenses, having the mindset that rather than waiting to go investigate a crime they've committed, let's try and take them down for something else before they really do something serious. Feeling like drastic measures had to be made, calling this one of the deadliest periods in Richmond since the Civil War, while also adopting the nickname Murder City in the process. So kicking off the month of November of 95, 13 people were murdered in a 12-day period, and most of those victims, they were shot in the head. At least 3 were shot in the face. This includes a 38-year-old woman who would be blasted with a shotgun, point-blank range. In the year of 1995 alone, 3 out of 4 major drug operations were shut down throughout the city. You can compare it to kicking the hornet's nest, with both heroin and cocaine being the honey that kept the whole thing in order. And this would create a vacuum. Now other young soldiers was already planning to become the next kingpin. So you can say it was an in-house civil war going on outside that nobody was safe from, not even Marvin. Which brings us to the early Tuesday morning of June 13th. The 10-member Violent Crimes Unit would track down Marvin's location to Jefferson Village in South Richmond. After finding the correct apartment, Marvin, who was fully dressed down to his Reeboks at 4:55 in the morning, hit the window within seconds of hearing the officers knock on the door. Leaping from the second floor, he didn't get far. The task force, who had previously had a run-in with Marvin, had eluded them once before, and they knew he would run. So planning ahead, they brought along Ernie, the police dog, the very dog he'd land beside after jumping out of the window. He tried making a quick getaway, but was chased down within seconds, Ernie biting him on the leg and the shoulder, making him the 3rd career criminal apprehended by the Richmond Violent Crimes Task Force since the unit hit the streets April 15th of that year. Marvin had been wanted by the Richmond police for nearly a year on firearms charges, 2 counts of shooting into an occupied dwelling, possession of a firearm by convicted felon, murder, attempted murder, robbery. They described Marvin as one of the area's most violence-prone criminals, and he was finally off the streets. After wrapping up the task force, they would do a search of Marvin's home. 2 days later, where they find rap lyrics that he would detail multiple murders known and unknown. But what shocked this detective the most, there were multiple murders that he could put a name to, but it was 5 other murders that he couldn't. There were 5 other victims who were unknown, didn't know where they were from, didn't know if their bodies were ever to be found. But as we all know that without a confession, a first-year lawyer can fight that as circumstantial evidence at best. Now it's almost a week after Marvin's arrest, and he get caught conspiring to kill a woman, by the name of Mandy Lightfoot. A risky attempt at silencing anyone who prepared to testify against him. And once all hope is lost, when there was no shadow of a doubt that he was never coming home, he'd take one more shot at freedom by attempting to escape from the Northern Neck Regional Jail in Warsaw, Virginia, threatening a fellow inmate in the process named Tyrone Blue to cooperate or he would harm him in the worst way. But the plan was feeble as it was impossible and was shut down as quick as it started. And eventually, the DA would go for the death sentence, but Marvin would strike up a deal. And the deal was this: he was to tell about all murders that he's ever committed, ever conspired in, ever had a hand in, and that was the only way he would get life without parole. And as far as other factions or big names I spoke on in this story, they themselves have a story of their own to be told, so I only briefly touched on them, but they will be saved for a later day. So as we close out today's story, I want to remind everyone of the people who lost their lives, the kids who grew up without their fathers, and the families who are forever changed by the destruction that the crack epidemic started. You know, effects that we're still feeling today. Once upon a time, I myself glorified guys like Marvin, looked up to the big man at the top like Robert, who had it all. But not everybody can break that mentality and see life from a different perspective. So who or what do we blame? You know, do we blame Marvin for becoming the person that his own life struggles made him into? You know, do we blame the families we come from for passing down such a toxic ideology? What about the people responsible for the crack epidemic itself? Until you figure that part out, let's make sure we love, pay attention, and teach the youth for the day so we can never breed another Marvin. Instead of glorifying the killers, let's start celebrating the life of the victims. Rest in peace to the fallen. And y'all stay safe out there. And we out.
Call me, D.
Hustler talk, no comment though, just paper chase. Chasing my dreams, my nightmares ain't got no money. Just a cardboard sign and they existing so bummy. And they want me down with them at the bottom of the